Today I'm going to be doing another watercolor tutorial, but this one is going to be more in-depth with how I choose my colors and really just my process in general, because I feel like my last video I didn't really go into much detail, therefore in hindsight I don't think it was actually that helpful. I'm going to be using my Home watercolor sketchbook, my White Nights 12 set watercolors, my Artist's Soft brush, and this chipped palette I found at a kid's art store once. Oh, and also a brush pen for when I'm inking after. This time I'm going to be showing you my reference photos so you guys can see what I take away when I'm using them and how I choose my colors from them. So you can see I've already done the sketch because I already know that this is going to be a long one from just the painting, so we'll just skip that for now. We're going to first talk about masking fluids. These are liquid you put on top of paper to keep from wetting that part of the paper that you don't want to be painting on. This is great for highlights and sometimes even on top of layers you've already painted on to preserve some of those parts. First thing I do is pick out the brightest parts of the picture and put my masking fluid on those parts, because this time I want to be leaving those parts completely white, so I'm putting them down before I even start painting because I want this to look deceptively simple and clearly the process is not. Then I'm just gonna go ahead and wait for it to dry. When I'm choosing colors, I feel like it's a really simple process for me, but I hope it makes sense to everyone else. When I'm painting, I want to limit my palette to only using 4 colors. The first one is the dominant color, and this is, well, as the name suggests, the color I want to dominate the whole painting with. Usually this is from the reference photo. This is the color that would grab your attention first. So in this one I'm going to be choosing green because I really like that color on her coat and I want that to be my main color. So the second color I choose is its complementary color. So since my first color is green, I'm going to be choosing my second color as red, or the closest thing I have to a pure red in this set, which is carmine. The third color is just the highlight color. Usually it's something bright but doesn't stray too far from the dominant color. So this time I'm going to be going with yellow, and then the last color is going to be a darker color that you can use to darken up the dominant color without just using that same color on top of each other. It can even be black, but usually I try to avoid that, so this time I'm using blue. This process for the first layer I think is very simple. First I take the complementary color, this time it's red, and I put it on the darkest parts of the photo. And then I'm going to take my dominant color, or my main color, which is green, and lay that there next to the red while it's still wet. And I really like having these two mixed together because I think it creates this beautiful dark saturated color. But I leave out some of the red untouched so it maintains its own color, and the same goes for the green. I just really want these two next to each other, so if they do mix, they make that dark color that I want, but I don't actively try mixing them together. And then I take my yellow, which is the highlight color, and start laying it down from the brightest parts and then slowly bringing that into the green. The same thing applies where I don't really actively mix them together. I just want them side by side and to only mix where they touch. The hair, I want it to look different, but I'm still going to be using the same colors, so I'm mixing those same colors but in a different order, so it doesn't look too similar but it still would be cohesive. This time I'm going to be starting with the red and then mixing in some of the yellow for the highlights still, and then I put some of the same green that I used for her coat in as my shadow color this time. And then to really saturate the darker parts of her coat, I'm going to be pre-mixing my red and green in the palette before I lay it down on my paper. But at this point this layer is still wet, so all I'm really doing is taking that paint and dipping it into the dark corners and letting the water do its job and spread it. Now, I didn't really list down the colors I did for the skin at the beginning because for this one, I'm not going to be painting much of it at all. I'm going to leave most of it blank this time. So really quickly, I used cadmium red, that orange looking color on the left of my set, and mixing a quick purple for the shadows using that same red and blue I used for her coat. Now her pants, I want to mostly use the same yellow, but this time it's a bit more of a wild card because it's been mixed in with some of the colors that I put in the palette. At this point, it's a bit of a mess because I don't really follow the advice of using 2 jars of water to clean my brush. In fact, I don't even fully use one. I use about 3 inches of water in my jar, just enough to quickly rinse it off before I start painting again. And the same goes for my palettes. I don't really worry too much about the colors mixing together. I think it makes the overall look not too vibrant and loud, and it brings it down a bit, and that's kind of the aesthetic that I'm going for almost all of my paintings. For her shirt, I used the same blue I have sparsely used for her skin and her pants, but I'm bringing in some of the other colors in my palette, so it's more toned down and not really that original vibrant blue. And then I carefully start painting and making sure it doesn't touch the jacket because that hasn't fully dried yet, and I'm too impatient to wait for it to dry before I start painting. And then I used that exact same blue for her book, and I really like to quickly go ahead and add a little bit of the red for her pants because I feel like it was looking a little too yellow for me and the blue wasn't doing much to offset that. And then I wait for it all to dry before I take off my masking fluid. This process was a pain for me because I found that these cheap masking fluids don't peel as easily as something that would maybe cost a little bit more. I had another one that peels like a dream, but I had to use my brushes for it, and that was before I realized that that wasn't a good idea. So at least for next time, I know to get a masking fluid that comes with an applicator still. So this whole process probably took me about 8 whole minutes of me just scrubbing into the paper until my fingers are raw. So it's really important to pick out a good masking fluid. Now that that's all done, I can see that her face needed a little bit more brightening up. So I've taken my cadmium red and placed it on some places right next to the highlight. I've also realized that I want her shirt to look more blue, so I'm putting that there now instead of later when my colors start mixing together, because I want to get that really vibrant blue for this one. I'm using a different part of my palette, so it's not contaminated by the other colors. And then I'm gonna start painting on the coat again. First I do the same thing and mix my red and green, but this time in my palette, so it's nice and dark. And I also start mixing my green and highlight color, so that's yellow, but then going closer to the lighter parts. And on some parts I add a little bit more red, and on other parts I add a little bit more yellow, because I don't want to keep using the same colors, even when they're on the same parts of the picture and on the same layer. I always want to maintain these shifts in color. They're subtle, but I think they make a huge difference in the results after. I also like to do this technique where I lay down my colors first, and then I rinse off my brush before I lay it down on the paper, drag down just water into the paint I just laid down, and it creates this really nice gradient effect that I like. But I have heard that not all paints will react the same way on water, so it'll be interesting when I get my Mijello Mission Gold Pure Pigment set, because I have heard that those paints are more predictable, so they won't spread out so much, and it's interesting to see if it will affect my technique and my art style at all. A technique that I use a lot is called negative painting, and it's demonstrated on this part where I paint her pocket. Instead of painting on it directly, I'm gonna paint around it instead and bring it out by leaving it light around the darker parts. So really I'm just building up contrast with the dark parts. Now I'm just gonna add a little more purple on the shadows for her pants, because it was still looking a little too plain yellow to me. As I'm doing this, I'm keeping myself conscious of the folds of her pants, and I really like to keep the parts right beside the highlights to be dark and saturated, to really increase that contrast and give it that look that I want. And now that I'm done with all of that, I'm actually going to be painting some of the parts that I left blank with my highlight color, because the white was looking a little too jarring for me. But I'm going to be doing that on her face still, because I like to keep that part simple, and as long as I'm getting her expression right, that's what's important. Right now I'm just adding some more accent colors for her skin to make her look more vibrant next to her already vibrant colored clothes. And then I'm just adding more blue in with my red and green mix to darken up some parts and to really increase the contrast, to bring up some folds of her clothes like the ones near her pockets. Inking is really fun for me to watch because it really brings out the whole thing together. But first I want to fix some things with my trusty Posca pen on her book and on the underside of her chin, where I painted over the highlight a little. And now I can really start inking. When I'm inking, I like to draw out outside of where I've painted on, like with the strands of her hair and some lines of her face and her glasses. I feel like this really is what brings the whole style together, and the way I achieve those really tiny details is very carefully, only using the tip of the brush pen, and then really pushing on it, because this is a really stiff brush, to get some of those thick lines that I want for the darker parts. I also used one of my Holbein colored pencils for some parts of her face, and I'm bringing that over to her clothes too to really bring the colors together. It's very subtle, but I really think it makes a difference. Very lastly, I feel like some parts needed more shadows, and I was really nervous about this going in because none of the brush pens I used were waterproof, so I know they'll bleed if I add water to them. But then I realized that I wanted it to look dark anyway, so if it bleeds then I'm fine with that too. I just need to really make sure I'm careful with where my water goes. And that is it for the end of the video. Thank you guys for watching.